All right, hi everybody. Hopefully you're all doing great out there. Thanks for watching. So in this video, I want to do as I promised I would, and that's to connect Locke to um, the Declaration of Independence. So in particular, Locke's Second Treatise of Government and certain aspects of it that are, central to the way the Declaration of Independence was written and developed. So when I initially studied the Locke Second Treatise of Government, it was actually as an undergraduate at Cal Poly, just like all of you. And the professor in the course, he he explained very briefly that the Declaration of Independence was a Lockean document through and through, were his words. And then he kind of left it to the student to do a bit more research on that. So what I want to kind of do is, say a bit more than what my uh, uh, professor, well, over 20 years ago, taught me on the topic. So, um, so I think where I'll just kind of pick up, there's a lot that could be said, but there's just a few points I want to make. So I want to capture Locke on tyranny, and this is, part of the text that I didn't require of you. So this is why I don't want to go into too much detail on it. But Locke on tyranny. Here's a passage where actually let me do this for now so you can see it better. So here's a passage from later on in the text. There's a chapter called Tyranny toward the end of the Second Treatise of Government. And this is after Locke has done work like discussing his theory of property, his the formation of political societies, and then discusses the various ways a political society can develop in terms of monarchy, aristocracy, etc. And and then wants to deal with like what can go wrong in in a political society. And so, well, one thing that can go wrong in a political society is you can have a tyrannical sovereign. And he he says this at the very beginning of his tyranny chapter. It's a short chapter, so if you wanted to check it out, please do. He writes, whereas usurpation is the exercise of power to which someone else has a right. Usurpation is the chapter just before chapter tyranny, where he describes what it is. So it's the exercise of power to which someone else has a right. So think about how, in the case of when one group usurps another group's political power, well, that group that does usurping is exercising the power of another. Um, um, Tyranny is the exercise of the power to which nobody can have a right. So think about the case of usurpation would be, suppose some king gets killed, and then the person who does the execution, the person who's committed the regicide, becomes king. Well, that'd be a case of usurpation, all things being equal. Tyranny is the exercise of a power to which nobody can have a right. Okay, so this is a different kind of case. So tyranny is somehow an exercise beyond one's right to exercise. So exercise a power beyond what one would have a right to. And of course, in the case of sovereigns, would be the case of a sovereign exercising a right beyond their power to do so, or exercising a power beyond their right to do so. So this is what happens when someone employs the power he has in his hands, not for the good of those who are under it, but for his own private individual advantage. It is what happens when a governor, however entitled he is to govern, is guided not by the law, but by his own wants. His commands and actions are directed not to preserving his subjects' properties, but to satisfying his own ambition, revenge, covetousness, excuse me, or any other irregular passion. Um, so that's a general formulation of what tyranny is, and then from here he goes on to actually quote James the First, um, who was king. He says, "If you don't accept my words on this point, perhaps you could accept the words of a king." Deprecating there a bit. So let me see if I've got the passage from the Locke I could show you. Um, So this is usurpation chapter. And then the tyranny chapter, he says, section 200 here, let me make this larger for you so you could see it. He says, if you doubt that this be true or to be reasonable because it's written by a mere lowly subject like Locke, I hope you will take it from the authority of a king. King James I in his 1603 speech to the Parliament said this: in making good laws and constitutions, I will always put the welfare of the public and of the whole Commonwealth ahead of any particular and private purposes of mine, because I think that the wealth and the welfare of the Commonwealth is my greatest welfare and worldly happiness. So tying, his happiness, James I's happiness, with the happiness of his Commonwealth. In this respect, a lawful king sharply differs from a tyrant, for the greatest point of difference between the two is that whereas the proud and ambitious tyrant thinks his kingdom and people are only ordained for satisfying his desires and unreasonable appetites, the righteous and just king does, on the contrary, acknowledge that he has been given the task of preserving the wealth and property of his people, right, of the Commonwealth. And then in 1609, in his 1609 speech to the Parliament, he said this: and the king binds himself by a double oath to observe the fundamental laws of his kingdom. Just by being a king, he tacitly binds himself to protect not just the people, but also the laws of his kingdom. By his oath at his coronation, he explicitly binds himself to the same thing. If the king governs the coronation would be, when the king becomes king properly. If the king governing in a settled kingdom stops ruling according to his laws, he thereby stops being a king and degenerates into a tyrant. And then a little after, therefore, all kings who are not tyrants or perjured will be glad to bind themselves within the limits of their laws, and those who try to persuade them otherwise are vipers, pests, against both the king and the commonwealth. Okay, so thus that learned king, James I, quite a good grasp of concepts, distinguishes king from tyrant. Okay, and then he ends up going on to say that you can have another kind of sovereign, which is also tyrannical. So a king limits his power to what the laws allow and governs for the good of the public, whereas a tyrant puts his own will and appetite ahead of everything. And then section 201 here, he goes on to make the claim that I just made about other forms of government becoming tyrannical as well. Okay, so that's Locke on tyranny. Hopefully you can see this okay. Hopefully you could see the passage that I just had up there. Yeah, you should be able to. Here's just another passage where at his conclusion of the discussion of tyranny, I'm kind of cutting to the chase here a bit. He writes this using a metaphor to guide us. If a long train of action shows the governmental councils all tending that way, tending the way toward tyranny, how can a man not be convinced of which ways things are going and look around for some way to save himself? How can a man not be convinced of the way which things are going and look around for some way to save himself? So if you start seeing tyrannical actions, then do you have the evidence you need to do what you need to start figure out how you're going to save yourself? Suppose you're in a ship. So here's the metaphor. Suppose you're in a ship whose captain is steering a course towards Algiers, a very unsafe place to be if you're English back in the days where they were enslaved. There was lots of piracy. So suppose you're on a ship whose captain is steering a course toward Algiers. Crosswinds, leaks in his ship, and shortage of men and provisions often force him to head in a different direction. But as soon as the weather and other circumstances allow it, he always turns back on course for Algiers. Won't you conclude the captain is trying to take you and everyone else in the ship to Algiers? So suppose you have a king who becomes a tyrant. So you have a tyrant who acts tyrannically regularly. There might be ways in which the tyrant's plans get stifled from time to time, but if he continues along with his self-interested and self-motivating ways without looking out for the Commonwealth and the laws in the Commonwealth, then won't you think that this tyrant will just continue being tyrannical and compromising one's well-being, perhaps even people's lives within that political arrangement? So this is the Algiers example that he likes to use to say, like, when things are getting sufficiently bad, we have good reason, it seems, to begin thinking about options to save ourselves, thinking about options to save ourselves. So 3 key points. 1, tyranny is the exercise of power beyond a sovereign's right. 2, when tyranny is sufficiently lasting, then people have the right to protect or to save themselves. Let me get some commas in here. And 3, in such cases as 2, political revolution is permissible. Okay, so we know that for Locke, that there's a vertical contract in addition to a horizontal one at the original contract, at the original formation of the political society, which means that there are checks on the sovereign's power. Suppose the sovereign's the king, there'd be checks on the king's power. And when the king doesn't abide by these checks, then the king becomes tyrannical. When he becomes sufficiently tyrannical, when there's a lasting account, you might say, of abuses of power, then, well, the people become endangered, and then they have the right to revolt, a political right to revolution. We saw that Locke, his political philosophy didn't allow for this. You could self-preserve and all the rest, self-defend, but there's no political right to revolution. But for Locke, there was, and as it's going to turn out, there was also for Jefferson, and subsequently then the Declaration of Independence, which Jefferson didn't write by himself. I mean, he was a person who was put in charge of the project, but he did get feedback on it, and was very likely inspired by ideas from Locke, even if he didn't explicitly endorse that idea when asked about it. So just so you know, Jefferson was born in 1743, died in 1826. He's the founding father of the United States of America, founding parent, if that's a terminology that you prefer. He's the author of the Declaration of Independence, 1776, which is when the War for Independence began. So remember, this time is coinciding roughly with Lexington and Concord, which happened a bit before the Declaration was finished being written. And of course, he was the 3rd president of the United States after George Washington and John Adams. Famous for the Louisiana Purchase in his presidency, but probably most famous for being the author of the Declaration of Independence, which catapulted us into all-out war with the quote-unquote mother country, England. And it was a grueling war, which culminated in, of course, the quote-unquote colonies becoming the United States. And then for a time, there were the Articles of Confederation that were weakly connecting or uniting the 13 colonies. It wasn't until the Constitutional Convention, the writing of the Constitution and its ratification in the late 1780s and early 1790s, with the rise of George Washington as the president, as our first president, that we start seeing the United States of America as unified, federal republic, coming to its own, as it were, or at least begin to. But obviously, it starts, at least for us, very often when we study history, with 1776. Okay, many events led up to 1776, as you can imagine. So there's just a image from Wikipedia where this was like an 1823 version of it that they have a picture of on their site. So I'll provide the link there if you wanted to check it out and do some research on your own on Declaration of Independence. Okay. And what I wanted to do from here is just read some passages from the text. I think that as we do, you'll see echoes of Lockean philosophy and what we learned from Locke. So here's our Declaration of Independence. chosen this one to have you read is kind of nicely laid out and readable. It's got this long footnote here that you don't have to really worry about. Really, the text is important, and most likely you know the gist of the Declaration of Independence, or at least at least some things about it. If you don't, then this is a cool opportunity to learn something about a foundational document to the United States of America. So the unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America, July 4, 1776. So it's interesting that we celebrate Independence Day with the day that coincides with the writing of the Declaration of Independence, not like when we actually win the war in 1781 later. Okay, but so when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, humankind, requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Okay, so you probably already likely see something here in this paragraph that's Lockean, this idea of the laws of nature. Okay. And something that's also Lockean is the dissolution of the political bands, which have connected people with each other. The dissolution of a political society. And so think about how Locke thinks that dissolution of a political society is permissible. That's, in the in perhaps the most robust way that one can dissolve is by way of declaring a revolution and going to war for that dissolution. There's a chapter in the second treatise of government titled The Dissolution of Government. So again, you can check that out and see that for yourself. So at least see a couple of concepts here. And of course, Locke believes in God. Jefferson's views on God are maybe a bit complicated. There's something like the Jefferson Bible. If you're interested, we can talk about that, where he attempts to understand the Bible as much as he can, in at least the New Testament of the Bible, in as little miracle-ridden language as possible. Setting that aside, he continues, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Self-evident meaning just by reflecting upon them, a mature, rational mind would see that they're true, obviously true. So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator, by God, with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, Lockean ideas here. Okay, so remember, the laws of nature are laws that can be understood through reason and rational reflection. Key difference is Jefferson focuses on the pursuit of happiness and not property. So Locke is known for emphasizing life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Jefferson, he says, with the United States of America, that he envisioned that it would be about the pursuit of happiness, even if you didn't have property. Of course, property can be essential to gaining happiness, but Jefferson thought that we should have the pursuit of happiness instead of property, as Locke had it. And Locke has a very robust notion of property that I didn't have, that I didn't teach and didn't have you study. So I'll set that aside. But that's the key difference here. So that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their, so to secure rights, secure property rights is what Locke emphasizes, but for Jefferson, he's saying life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, think about the king, King James, that Locke cited in one of the slides that we just went over. There, King James the First is capturing a very common idea. We got to protect people's rights. That's uphold the laws, contribute to people's well-being, their happiness. Okay, we see that echoed in Locke. We see it echoed here in Jefferson, and in a way, Jefferson can say, like, okay, before this, British law prevailed as superior, or at least that's what it was supposed to be, but it had committed itself. earlier in its history, earlier in its constitutional development, to these higher standards. Okay. And since they've fallen short, then Jefferson can say, boom, well, now we have reason to dissolve. You're not holding up the end of your bargain in line with what, say, for example, King James the first thought. So that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That sound Lockean to you? Yeah, the consent of the governed. Okay. Of course, that's Hobbes as well, the consent of the governed, but it's just the details end up being different for Locke and for Jefferson. Okay. So for Hobbes, it's securing our our safety and the like. That's more emphasized. But for Locke, it's our rights. And Jefferson is following suit with that. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, in line with Locke's view of the original contract. Okay, there being a vertical agreement, so that means there can be breaches, contract, etc. And to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments of self-interest will you dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. So we need to have good reasons before we change governments, before we dissolve government and create a new one. And accordingly, all existence hath shewn is the term that's used here, that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. So people tend to just suffer as opposed to make the relevant changes to contribute to their happiness. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government. She's making the strong claim here. It's not just the right to do it; it's also a requirement, potentially. Okay, to reduce, it is their right to throw off such a government, Okay. So the warning against having trivial reasons for wanting to overthrow a government or for wanting to dissolve a union, which is discussed in Locke as well, as it turns out, to like when we have a long train of abuses. I mean, we have sufficient evidence of the abuse and it's piling on, as it were, then it is a right, if not a duty, to overthrow the government that is creating such tyranny, and to provide new guards for their future security. So guards, capital G, a new government with new sovereignty, new enforcers, etc. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Britain, King George III, is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. Okay, so we get to the end of the second paragraph here, a long second paragraph. Okay, and up to this point, it's very beautiful, moving writing, some of which we've heard before, maybe not all of it, but still very moving writing. And then we get the list, we get the train of abuses laid out. King George III has refused to assent laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws. He has refused to pass other laws for accommodation of large districts of people. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses. He's refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners. right? Just down the line, we get a whole long line of them. Okay, very often when we study the Declaration of Independence in grade school, we don't talk about these passages. Um, and I just want to call your attention to them, not so much as go through and deliberate about them. But there have actually been books written about these, and then even responses by some British thinkers, British political scientists, commentators who say that there were responses that King George had to each one of these charges. Okay, maybe some are still bitter on the other side of the pond regarding what happened in 1776 and thereafter. Okay. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless, quote unquote, Indian savages. Okay. Terminology that we don't accept anymore. So we saw similar terminology if you saw it in the Locke and in the Hobbes. Locke and the Hobbes, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Claiming that the way that they conduct warfare, the natives that were here were, barbaric in comparison to the ways that the colonists fought. Okay, obviously issues with some of these passages, colonial style passages that now sound bad to the modern ear. Okay, so you're gonna see that in almost anything that you read from the history of philosophy. Sad to say, but it puts us in a position to understand our past. Okay. Okay, and then we, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions due in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And here are the, signing their life away if you get defeated by the one of the most powerful armies, if not the most powerful army, navy in the world at the time. Okay, basically death warrants. So courageous act indeed, which has led to where we're at to this day. And there's a lot of discussion that could be had on all these topics, but that's our Declaration of Independence, a foundational document where we have, these very Lockean ideas about how we're living at a time here in 1776 where we the people we're being pressed over here. We're being led by a tyrannical George III, and England has committed themselves to a system whereby tyranny is to be met with revolution if necessary or if required. And we're going to follow suit. We're going to hold that true because the colonists are saying, Jefferson is saying, we're not going to continue along with the captains continuing to sail to Algiers, right? We're not going to go that route. And as I mentioned before, it kind of begins, the seeds of things begin with the Magna Carta in the early 13th century, where their attempts to check the power of the king, the monarch, prevent the king from turning into a tyrant, mostly didn't work out well, but the seeds were planted there for what happens later, and it deeply influenced thinkers like Jefferson and those who were steeped in the relevant political philosophy to say, hey, King George III has breached his contract such that he's become a constant tyrant, such that we have the right to dissolve and follow the teachings of John Locke and others, perhaps in the tradition, who would say revolution is coming, revolution is acceptable when that happens. So that's the connection between the Declaration of Independence, written by Jefferson with help from others, and Locke's Second Treatise of Government, at least what we studied of it. There's a lot more that could be said, but I'll leave it there. Thanks for watching. I'll go ahead and stop sharing. Wish you all well, and please reach out with any questions you have. I'm happy to help out. Thank you. Bye.